romance, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 6. There is no merit in such goodness. Hello, husband.
Hello, little untaught girl.
I hope to soon be taught, but thank you.
Well, yeah. This chapter 6 is where we use a lot of this show. Interesting. Mm-hmm. I found that there were lots of juxtaposition, dichotomies, and I felt like there was even in our way of thinking, based on your show notes, I was wondering if this might be the one episode where we're not butting heads, but I feel like we read this chapter completely differently. Yeah, and I mean, I would assume that you are the scholar here when it comes to Jane Eyre, so you can tell me live on the air
my opinions.
If I'm getting it wrong. Yeah, if I'm getting it wrong or not. But
so let's get into our chapter summary for chapter 6. This is from Spark Notes. On Jane's second morning at Lowood, the girls are unable to wash as the water in their pitchers is frozen. Jane quickly learns that life at the school is harsh. The girls are underfed, overworked, and forced to sit still during seemingly endless sermons. Still, she takes comfort in her new friendship with Helen, who impresses Jane with her expansive knowledge and her ability to patiently endure even the cruelest treatment from Miss Scatcherd. Helen tells Jane that she practices a doctrine of Christian endurance, which means loving her enemies and accepting her privation. Jane disagrees strongly with such meek tolerance of injustice, but Helen takes no heed of Jane's arguments. Helen is self-critical only because she sometimes fails to live up to her ascetic standards. She believes that she is a poor student and chastises herself for daydreaming about her home and her family when she should be concentrating on her studies.
So Jane finally gets a friend, and they're arguing.
No, that's not arguing.
I mean, just they have opposing views.
I think Jane is a little girl, and she's very young and inexperienced, and Helen has a very particular viewpoint that she imparts to Jane, where it's not that they're disagreeing, it's that Jane can't understand Helen's viewpoint, which I think I can feel the same way. I think that her viewpoint is very particular and difficult, I think, to live by.
Okay. Well, I feel like you are going to take the role of Jane, and I'm going to take the role of Helen in this chapter. And I think we may have mentioned it on a previous episode, but Helen Burns is my favorite character in this whole book. And so I know you were joking about, you feel a kinship for Helen.
Well, I feel a kinship for Helen because she just loves to read, and she takes every opportunity she can. Jane is watching her. She's reading on her own when there's a school break. So that was me when I was in school. I like to read.
And then I feel a kinship with her because I feel like she's like wise beyond her years. She prefers to find her own happiness rather than holding grudges or focusing on the negativity around her. I was a very pessimistic person when I first got out of college and stuff, and then I always joke about it, but I had a friend who actually pulled me aside one time and said, we don't like being around you when you're like this. And so I always tried to kind of find a more positive outlook. And so it was interesting to see the way that Charlotte kind of frames this whole chapter. I think we talked about it before in previous episodes that it's a continuation of chapter 5. Like it could also be, it could be kind of one big chapter, but then you put a dividing line in there because chapter 5 was mostly about the school rituals, and then this chapter kind of narrows the focus to Helen's treatment, more or less. It's
Jane getting to know Helen too.
Well, getting to know Helen, but also getting to know what keeps happening to Helen, which I was not. They kind of go on that for a while. There's a lot of descriptions of the way that Miss Scatcherd treats Helen, and with Jane being the narrator, what I thought was kind of interesting is that it's very biased narration, like as if Charlotte is sort of trying to get the reader on Jane's side to feel some anger and resentment toward the people who are oppressing Helen, like to kind of infuriate the reader.
Right.
Which...
Well, you're saying that maybe Miss Scatcherd is not quite the way that we see her in this book, she's not as mean as we
No.
seem to think of her.
I'm not saying that. It's more about it's like Charlotte wants you to be as upset as Jane is, whereas Helen doesn't seem to mind.
Right.
You know, and whereas Helen seems to be taking the high road, and yet the way that some of the way of the writing is, you know, I'm going to drop a quick quote here, and it's the very end of the chapter. You know, you've had, you know, this is a short chapter. I think it was 6 pages in my copy, and I feel like a lot of it was just spent with the two of them, not, like I said, not arguing, just discussing their views on life, and also Jane's vivid description of the way that she is being mistreated. And so at the very end of the chapter, after, you know, when Helen is telling her creed or whatever,
yes,
and she says, the quote that she says is, "Revenge never worries my heart, degradation never too deeply disgusts me, injustice never crushes me too low. I live in calm, looking to the end." And so I read that as this sort of kind of uplifting viewpoint, like she's going to block out all this negativity, you know, but then the very next sentence is Charlotte saying, "Helen's head, always drooping, sank a little lower as she finished this sentence." Like Charlotte is trying to make her sound so defeated, but I don't want to believe that she's defeated. I want to believe she's more positive. And I think it goes back to what I was saying before about these juxtapositions, because 2 chapters earlier, and this is my significant quote of that chapter, was Jane herself saying that vengeance had a metallic and corroding aftertaste.
Right.
And yet here she is saying, well, if anybody strikes me, you should strike them back. And it was like, but wait a minute. I thought, you know, Helen's supposed to be the one that she's going to learn a lot from. But yet it's like, I thought she was just starting to learn that before she even got to Lowood. Now we have a character who's visualizing this, you know, eye for an eye is not a good thing. And yet she just, I don't know, it was weird the way that Charlotte wrote that. The way that Charlotte put that, she pointed out Helen's head was always drooping. And it was just like, okay, but she seems to not let anything slide. Everything just slides right off her back.
Yeah, I guess, I feel like this is an interesting chapter because you have Jane's point of view and Helen's point of view. And they're very different, but if you read the story more, you'll see that this is the part where Jane is learning from Helen, and Jane's point of view gets tempered by Helen's philosophy going forward, you know, with her life experience with Mr. Rochester and etc. So, you know, it's something to look at right now. What is Helen saying to her? But it's not going to change Jane completely, which is important because Jane is not Helen. I don't know if this is a sustainable life philosophy, because I feel like this is something that's really hard to live up to, of just always turning the other cheek. Reminds you of a certain character, like in the Bible, like Jesus. He's like she's very, her creed is forgiveness and turning the other cheek.
Why did you let Miss Scatchard hit you like that? It was cruel.
She is severe. She dislikes my faults.
She struck me, I'd resist. I'd break the rod under her nose.
Probably you'd do nothing of the sort. But if you did, Mr. Brocklehurst would expel you from the school. It's far better to endure patiently a slight which nobody feels but yourself than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you. Besides, the Bible bids us return good for evil.
But to be singled out for punishment before so many people, I could not bear it.
But I do wonder, because Helen Burns was inspired by Charlotte's eldest sister, Maria, who also died very young. And it's okay. And that Charlotte had written a letter to her publisher in 1847, where some people thought that Helen Burns' character was not very realistic. So Charlotte Bronte wrote, "You are right in having faith in the reality of Helen Burns' character. She was real enough. I have exaggerated nothing there. I abstained from recording much that I remember, respecting her lest the narrative should sound incredible. Knowing this, I could not but smile at the quiet, self-complacent dogmatism with which one of the journal lays it down that such creations as Helen Burns are very beautiful but very untrue. So now that we know that Helen is based on a real person in Charlotte Bronte's life, I think it's thought-provoking to come back and look at Helen in that light of like, okay, maybe how much of what Charlotte Bronte is writing here is something she actually experienced when she was in school with her sister, and like even with the teacher, Miss Scatcherd, was there a Miss Scatcherd there who was very kind of cruel to her sister, where she constantly pointed out her faults and never praised her for doing anything good? Like she couldn't see that she was such a good little girl, you know. Maybe Helen or the older sister Maria, you know, her lack of attention or her like sort of placid demeanor just really irked the Miss Scatcherd that was at that school with Charlotte Bronte. So,
well, I mean, I assume that Charlotte would have been at this school. Do we know? Do you have an idea?
I think she's about 8 years old.
About 8 years old. And then I know you know this off the top of your head. I'm going to put you on the spot. How old was Charlotte when she wrote Jane Eyre?
She was about 30, I think.
30, okay. Because I always wonder about this idea of when kids are at a certain age and they think, that's not fair. Mm-hmm. This isn't fair. We talked about it, I think, extensively on this show already. The first few chapters, Jane's her treatment
personality,
to Mrs. Reed is this isn't fair. And so maybe when she was at the school dealing with her sister, maybe she would have seen this teacher and said, this teacher is really mean, and then based Miss Scatcherd on that. And I often joke about how, like, at a certain point, kids get to an age where they realize, you know, they're always like, oh, my parents are so mean to me. Mm-hmm. This isn't fair. And then they hit a certain point in their life where they realize, oh, no, my parents were they were good. They were strict. They were providing guidance and discipline. They were doing
their best.
They were doing their best, yeah. And so, like, I know that there's this thought, man, when you're reading this book, you're just like, wow, why is Miss Scatcherd so mean to her? You also have, again, I'll point out, Charlotte Bronte, I think she's put a little bit of bias in there. She's trying to get their readers to resent.
I mean, it's
Miss
hard.
Scatcherd.
It's hard to you know, combat that point of view because obviously everyone has a bias. But I don't know, just from the facts of the way Miss Scatcherd would just pick on Helen. Helen would answer the question correctly, and then she'd just say, "Oh, you know, look at your fingernails." Like, she wouldn't say, "Oh, yeah, that's correct. That's correct. Good job, Helen." Okay. No. She'd pick on her, basically.
I'm not trying to take Miss Scatcherd's side. I'm just being, you know, devil's advocate here. But sometimes I feel like it's maybe she's hardening her up for life outside of Lowood.
Maybe Miss Scatcherd sees that Helen she wants to see Helen fight back. Like, she's waiting for her to say something to her where she'd be like, okay, maybe this little girl will be able to survive in this world if she can just stand up to me. Maybe.
The way I always looked at it, and I looked at it when I first read it, and I definitely looked at it as I was rereading it now, is that this idea in my head is that maybe she knows how good Helen can be and wants to get the best out of her. Mm-hmm. And that's something that came up with me. I'm going to tell a little story real quick. About 10 years ago, I had a job where there were 4 people at the job that were on the manager level. And then me, and there was about 8 of us, we were on the coordinator level. Mm-hmm. And so 3 of those 4 managers were like really, really, really friendly, really nice, buddy. One of them used to always try to get us to go out for happy hours and stuff like that. But there was one of the 4, and I want to say he was mean, but he was just very to the point. Mm. He was a little, it seemed like bossy, you know, even though he wasn't the director level, he was just the manager level. And I never liked dealing with him. Like, if I had to work on a title, you hoped it was a title that the other 3 managers were managing. Mm-hmm. If it was one with him, you're like, oh, God, I got to have to go to his office and deal with him. And it wasn't until he quit that I told him this on his last day. I said, you know, I feel like I misjudged you because I almost feel like you could see how good we were, and you didn't want to let us get lazy. Because it's so easy to happen in jobs, especially, I've been working in the film industry for however long. Sometimes people you just float your way up and just as long as you don't get fired, you can kind of climb the ladder, you know? And so, like, I feel like sometimes we might have gotten a little bit lazy, and he would see that and he would give us a task rather than just letting us enjoy our downtime or our laziness. And it wasn't until, like I said, about the time he left, and what he even pointed out to me, and I think we both kind of discussed it at that moment, was that he was trying to prepare us to be managers, which is something that his boss, my ultimate, the high person there, the director, said, like, we want you to be able, so that when a manager leaves, we want to just promote from within, and you have to be able to manage people, and you can't just, like, again, I was probably early 30s, and so I feel like it kind of dawned on me at that point, because I'm like, I always thought this guy was such a jerk, but then you realize, no, he probably could see we knew what we were doing, but we just weren't applying ourselves in the right way. And so maybe, again, and I'm not trying to justify the behavior of Miss Scatcherd, but at the same time, I'm like, I'm trying to just guess maybe why
just
this
another point of view.
Mean.
Yeah. Well, this could very well be it. I don't know what Miss Scatcherd would have been like. I don't know if we get to hear too much about her later on, so I don't know if she might have been a better, more kinder person to Helen if Helen had been a little less. Well, it seems like that the biggest thing that Miss Scatcherd hates about Helen is that she's lazy. Helen doesn't explain herself, so she thinks, well, she didn't wash her hands, she didn't put her stuff away. It's just she's just being lazy. So that's Miss Scatcherd trying to better Helen, I guess.
Well, they're orphans, right? They're all orphans, and so they probably come from a simpler life, and maybe this is just the chance for the teachers to kind of be like, you're not orphans anymore. Let's make you.
They're not only teachers; they're parents. They're raising them.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I feel like this brings us to another part of this conversation where we can really deep dive into Helen's point of view, Jane's point of view, and sort of Helen's wisdom. With Helen, I feel like there's a couple of quotes that really flesh out what her thinking is, and I'll just have you read them, Mike.
I'll be playing the part of Helen.
Yes, I'll play the part of Jane when I come back with Jane's point of view here. Yeah. So let's read a couple of quotes.
And it's funny because I feel like we're both like that in real life sometimes.
I'm more like Jane?
I feel like you're more like Jane and I'm more like Helen.
I love that.
Well, again, as you mentioned, Helen's got a lot of great quotes in this chapter, and there's a part of me that thinks that Jane is supposed to be like looking up to her and seeking her guidance, but then she does kind of push back a little bit. So the first Helen quote was, "It is far better to endure patiently a smart which nobody feels but yourself than to commit a hasty action whose evil consequences will extend to all connected with you. And besides, the Bible bids us return good for evil." And then there was another quote, which you also called out, which is, "Life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity or registering wrongs." I definitely feel like there's a sense of, it does get a little redundant because he does say the same thing a lot of times, very creative ways. Again, we've already established Charlotte Bronte is a very good writer. But yeah, so that idea of I don't know, returning good for evil, right? Killing with kindness, which is something that I always kind of swore by too.
Yeah, and this is Helen's, sort of direct responses to Jane when she's telling her about her experience with the Reeds and how much she hated living under the Reeds and what they did to her. And when Helen tells her these things, Jane says, quote, "When we are struck at without a reason, we should strike back again very hard. I am sure we should. So hard as to teach the person who struck us never to do it again." And then also she says, "I must dislike those who, whatever I do to please them, persist in disliking me. I must resist those who punish me unjustly. It is as natural as that I should love those who show me affection or submit to punishment when I feel it is deserved." And I feel like there's strong points in Jane's words as well. Obviously, I feel like Helen is right in some things too, where you can't always fight back and you can't always punish someone who does something to you. But sometimes it is better just to let it go.
Well, and we've established that, like Jane, you said, if she's going to teach that person never to do it again, I'm sure John Reed probably wasn't going to strike her again, right? After she fought back the first time, right? So we talked about it before. Standing up to bullies is a good thing, but I take issue with the fact that she says that I got to dislike people who persist in disliking me. Whereas I feel like if they dislike you, you don't even give them the time of day.
Oh,
what do they say?
Be indifferent to them, not actively dislike.
There's that term where they always say, "Oh God, what is it? It's rent free."
Oh, you're living in their mind rent free.
They're living rent free in your head. You say it's not worth it. And I think we've established. And I think you had it in your notes as well that Jane is still working through her grudge against the Reeds. And my thought was like, well, she's only 10.
Yeah.
It's still fresh in her mind. And I feel like sadly it sort of defined her life to this point, whereas with Helen, I think you put down that, she's resigned to suffering and endurance and doesn't try to change. And I feel like, she's an orphan as well. And she probably knows how much worse it would be for her outside of Lowood.
Yeah.
And I don't really think that she's like resigned to suffering as much as it is. She's just trying not to rock the boat, because I feel like we don't really get a lot of backstory on her at this point. We really don't know what her life must have been like before this.
Why is she at Lowood?
If she was in an orphanage, I'm sure it's probably even worse. Are they teaching you at the orphanage? Is it even more? Is it more susceptible to disease? Are they getting fed properly and stuff like that? And so I feel like, Helen has a very positive outlook on life, even though it might be simple-minded, it might be naive.
Well, that's where I feel like, and you mentioned with Charlotte Bronte describing Helen's head drooping, where she was looking to the end, and that seems like she's not really thinking about life. She's thinking about the afterlife. She's not focused on the here and now, and that's kind of where that's where I feel like her philosophy is so hard to follow, because she doesn't care about what happens to her now.
Yeah, I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I think that's maybe the Catholic school upbringing that you had versus what I had. It's easy to say that I don't see that when she says I'm looking to the end. I mean,
what does the end mean to you?
I could see more like an end game.
An end game,
like the end of Lowood. The end of her time at Lowood.
I don't think that's what.
Oh, no. Okay, exactly. That's why you're the one that would know. Like maybe you probably know more about this if Charlotte has talked about this, because I think she does kind of make some allusions to about eternity and stuff like that. Helen does, but I just look at it from just on a smaller level, on a micro level, that she's just looking to getting out of Lowood, and that's rather than saying the end of her life. That's unless it's what she's going for. Again, her head's drooping, and she's just, okay, I'm just, plodding along in this life. But then that's kind of, I don't know. That's
I don't know if this is something we should think about now, but it's just like, what would Helen be like as an adult? Like, what does this Helen have plan? What are her future plans? Like, what does she want to do when she grows up? Let's see what she says later on about that. I don't know if
I could see
really going to get that much.
I think she'd be a good mother. I think her kids would
wife and mother, yes.
I think her kids would be well trained, well behaved, and disciplined.
Or will they walk all over her and she's just going to let them do what they want because
maybe spoken like someone who probably walked all over her mother when she was growing up.
I was such a good child.
But I also wonder if someone like with Helen, if growing up with the experience that she had at Lowood, when she gets to be an adult, would she work as a nurse?
I could see that.
Something
in service, like helping people. Sure,
exactly. Did they have psychologists back then? Did they have a
therapists? They were probably just caretakers of the lunatic asylum, not really actually trying to help people. But yeah, I guess. Well, it's an interesting story.
Yeah,
poor Helen. So I just wanted to mention too that when I was driving home from work today, I was listening to my music library on shuffle, and this song came up, and I thought it reminded me strongly of like Jane's point of view, especially at this point. So I thought I'd share it with the podcast listeners and you. This is from the musical Matilda, which is based on the book by Roald Dahl, and it's the song "When I Grow Up." And Matilda sings, "Just because you find that life's not fair, it doesn't mean that you just have to grin and bear it. If you always take it on the chin and wear it, nothing will change. Just because I find myself in this story, it doesn't mean that everything is written for me. If I think the ending is fixed already, I might as well be saying I think that it's okay, and that's not right." That's that like I feel like little young Jane could be singing that lyric because she feels that she has to change the story for her, and Helen, she's just complacent.
That could be from Jane Eyre the musical.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't feel like Helen necessarily being complacent. I just feel like she knows there's a time and a place, and she can adapt. She's just choosing not to. Like I feel like she just again. I'll reiterate that she knows how much worse it is for her outside. And she because like I said, Jane doesn't know anything like that. Jane grew up with the Reeds. She was mistreated by the Reeds, but she was still living in luxury in a way. Whereas, so it's easier for her to be like, well, I know I can be better. I came from better. Maybe Helen didn't, and so she only knows that one way. And so she's like, well, I can put up with this because it means I get to stay at this institution. They have food. They have shelter. We don't know we don't know how bad it was.
I also feel like maybe Helen, she's afraid to rock the boat, like you said, and I don't know if that's such a good thing. We just have this viewpoint, Mike.
Yeah.
I feel like Helen is a little bit of a pushover.
Well, and like I said, sometimes you don't know what kind of grudges the people at the school are going to hold.
Yeah.
What if she rocks the boat too much, and then her classmates get punished? Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's little things like that. That's what I always think about. But anyway, we always like to wrap up the show with some sort of a meaningful passage or quote. And I think we try not to tell each other ahead of time. We always, it's always fun to.
It's nice to surprise.
Yeah, reveal it on the air. But I did think it was interesting. I did reveal to you off the air that my quote is from Helen, and you said your quote was from Jane.
Yes.
So it only makes sense. And we were just talking about Jane and Matilda the musical, aka Jane Eyre the musical. And so
there is a Jane Eyre the musical, and it's fantastic.
So, but why don't you give us your quote first?
Okay, so my quote is short, and it's something that I think has stayed with me for these many years because I feel like it's something that I agree with, and it is just a quick response that Jane says to Helen, where she says, "That is curious," said I. "It is so easy to be careful." So
that's all.
That is it. That's my quote, because I think sometimes when something happens, or if somebody messes up something, sometimes it's surprising to me. I can't think of a good example right now, but in the back of my head, I think, oh, it's so easy to be careful. It's so easy to be careful and not make those mistakes. Not like I never make mistakes, for sure. That's not true, but I think what I think about is, what does it mean to be careful? And this is, what does Jane mean when she says it's so easy to be careful? She's always aware of herself. She follows the rules. She's observant, and she notices when something needs to be done, which is something that I feel like I do sometimes, where I'm always aware of something is messed up, I gotta go fix it, or I try to be organized and neat and clean and prepared. And a careful person is dependable. And that's Jane. I think she's very dependable. So all of those things, then I think, well, then maybe Helen is not those things. Helen is not careful. She's not neat. She's not organized. She's not observant. She's always thinking, she's always in her head thinking about things. So I find it interesting that, that Jane and Helen are pretty opposite, and they're such good friends. And Helen has a lot to teach Jane, but I feel like Jane is also very smart, and she's careful.
Sure. Helen is the best character in the book.
Well, according to some people.
Well, yeah. And so that's why my quote comes from Helen as well, and it kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier before about that idea of living rent free, because they're having this I wouldn't say argument, this discussion, and Helen is trying to show her line of thinking, and then Jane brings up the fact that, well, what about this? What about this? Well, what if you do this? And then it says, then she tells the story about Mrs. Reed. Like, she's held off for a while. She finally tells the story about Mrs. Reed. And all I kept thinking about was this idea, that maybe is Miss Reed thinking about Jane nearly as much as Jane is still thinking about Mrs. Reed? Again, living rent free. And so the quote from Helen, after Jane has told her about how she was treated by Mrs. Reed, Helen says, quote, "What a singularly deep impression her injustice seems to have made on your heart. No ill usage so brands its record on my feelings. Would you not be happier if you tried to forget her severity together with the passionate emotions it excited?" And then she goes on to say, life appears to me too short to be spent in nursing animosity. Yeah. And so it brought up that, like, I even put it in my notes. She says, passionate emotions, passionate, underlying passion. That's Jane.
Right.
And so at the same time, it's just like, Mrs. Reed probably ain't even thinking about you anymore. And yet you're still harboring this. And I'm not going to let anybody have that effect on me. And so I kind of like that. Again, it goes back to that thing about just letting things slide and not just, don't get too worked up because it's bad for the blood. And why give other people the satisfaction? You know?
I mean, that's very true. I agree to that as well.
Yeah, and I feel like that I joke about it because I go on Twitter every so often. I'm usually discussing sports or movies or something. And it's one of the things that I've always felt like has plagued our society in the age of social media is that people are so quick to tell you about things that they hate versus things that they like.
Yeah, I feel that one too.
I used to always say, like, if you're McDonald's and you want to do a commercial, tell me how great the Big Mac is. Don't tell me how bad the Whopper is. And I think this came up recently on Twitter last week because I saw that Taylor Swift dropped another album. And I think it happens a lot with Taylor Swift, maybe Justin Bieber, those kind of people. Whenever they do anything, even if it's positive, like dropping an album, people will bring up, that'll be their opportunity to tell you how much they don't like Taylor Swift. And it's like, but what difference does it make? You're not going to listen to this album. Her fans are probably really excited about it. I think it had 30 songs on it. I have not listened to it yet, but I did listen to Taylor Swift, a different Taylor Swift album at the same time. And it was like, I don't get why you would waste the time and energy to why don't you just talk about things that you like? Go listen to the music that you like instead.
Yeah.
And
it is a sad facet of our society that we seem to gravitate towards negativity like that.
Yeah. And so Helen kind of predates that. Helen is here saying, why are you, letting this bother you? Now, yeah, you can go to a greater discussion and say, well, she should stand up for herself at a certain point. Yes. But at the same time, just speaking to one person who is younger than her. And again, I've told you that this is the one chapter where you and I might disagree on things. You are the Jane side. I am the Helen side. I am older than you. I have lived through things where I've said,
well, I'm not 10. Let's but I have lived through some stuff.
Yeah, but I've also felt like there's been things that have happened to me that I'm just like, moving forward, I'm not going to let that bother me no more.
Yeah.
And it's just.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think of myself as someone who holds grudges, that's for sure. But I also feel like you should stand up for yourself. And that's something that I don't see Helen doing at all.
When there's a time and place.
Well, we'll see.
That's where I feel like, yeah. But I mean, we've had it come up recently with the last few years with a lot of social justice movements and stuff like that.
Yes.
So you're like, good, finally people are standing up because you think back to, I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but you think back to like Occupy Wall Street.
Oh, wow.
That didn't seem to be as organized. And yet it just came and went, right? Whereas this one seems to have more of a staying power where it was like people were more motivated, I guess.
Well, before we wrap up the podcast, I saw that we have another very kind review on Apple Podcasts, and I wanted to share it. It says, I look forward to this podcast every week. Thanks so much for doing it. And we just really appreciate all the reviews that we get because it really helps our show grow. And it's always nice to receive feedback. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AirGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.